This session, I think I can certainly see by the strong attendance in this room, this session is going to be quite something. It is rare, I think, on one stage to have a grouping like this talking about the current state of China-U.S. relations. But I am so excited about this session, and particularly excited about our partnership with the Asia Society and our partnership with the Atlantic Council. First, I would like to thank Prime Minister Kevin Rudd of Australia, who serves on our Leadership Council and has been a wonderful friend to this organization and is joining us today, as well as Ian Bremmer, another member of our Leadership Council, one of the very early members of our Leadership Council, who has always been a great supporter. I'm honored as well to have, for the first time ever on our stage, Governor Jon Huntsman, a man that I personally have great respect for, has been an incredible public servant, is now chairing the Atlantic Council, which is one of our partners, as I've said. So very excited about this. Thank you so much to Yahoo Finance for being our media partner for this session, and to their editor, Andy Serwer, who we'll invite on the stage now to moderate with his panelists.
Thank you very much. Whoops, I gotta get my... All right, it's on. Thank you very much, Matt. We really appreciate it at Yahoo. And yeah, wow, this really is a great panel and a great topic. And you know, I couldn't think of three better people to talk to on the entire planet than these three guys. And the other thing that's really kind of cool, as you will see, I hope, is that they're kind of three amigos a little bit here. They know each other, they've got a good rapport, and I think they're going to play off of each other very, very well. And again, of course, they know the subject so very well. See, they're already at it. And it's almost hard to know where to begin with China, because it really, you know, as we were talking about Ian and Governor Huntsman and Prime Minister Rudd as well, I mean, it touches absolutely everything. I mean, the Middle East, Janet Yellen's decisions, deflation, Japan. I mean, you could just go on and on. And so I guess, Prime Minister, I'd like to start with you. You have sort of a new role as the head of the Asia Society.
Asia Society Policy Institute.
Right.
By the way, you didn't tell me about the sock requirement for today.
Yeah. Well, no, that was only for Ian.
Okay.
Ian was supposed to wear strange socks, and
But is that a plus or a minus?
and he yeah, and he followed through.
Certainly in my country to be a D-, but that's okay.
Wow.
But they're good.
All right, let's stick to the subject. They're probably made in China, those socks. So
Our Chinese friends have higher standards than that.
okay, all right.
Only because they've taken them from the Americans. That's the issue. It's an IP issue.
Okay, Mr. Prime Minister, can I ask you how you feel, how sanguine are you about the Chinese government's ability to handle the economic situation in their country right now? I'm going to just hit you right away with a biggie.
Two parts to the response. Can they manage a growth rate for the 2 to 3 years ahead, which keeps it above what they need to maintain social stability, which is a figure of around about 6%? And secondly, can they succeed in the prosecution of what is a well-prepared economic reform plan? And the question mark is not one of economics, it's one of political economy and their ability to do it. On the first question of ensuring the growth rate stays in and around 6, they are working on a range of measures now to ensure that's the case. And because you have the politics of the country at stake and of the party, I believe that they will do what is necessary and whatever it takes to bring about that number. And I'm talking about real measures of activity, not other calculations. The second point is, if you look at the blueprint for the transformation of the economic model, which is a comprehensive document released just on 2 years ago at the third plenum of the 18th Central Committee, called The Decision, it is a reasonable blueprint for reform to take China from labour-intensive, low-wage manufacturing for export, plus high levels of state investment in infrastructure as the engine of China's economic growth, into an economy which is more of a middle income economy based on high levels of private domestic consumption, a explosion in the services sector and new jobs being created there, plus on top of that a more vibrant private sector. On that program, which they have announced 2 years ago, there are mixed results so far. And what I would say on the question of state-owned enterprise reform, which is critical to the transformation, creating market space for vibrant Chinese entrepreneurs to step into the economy, as Jack Ma and Alibaba and people like that have done, but right across the breadth of the economy, it is too early to say whether they have fully bitten that bullet. So my answer to your question is, do they have what it takes on growth? Yes. On transformation, full transformation, question mark at this stage because of the political difficulty of fundamental state-owned enterprise reform.
Great. Governor Huntsman, President Xi just came here for a state visit, met with President Obama. How do you assess the visit? How did it go? Did we accomplish anything? Give us your take.
Well, you have to remember that this was Xi Jinping's first real state visit here in the United States as head of the party and president. Being president doesn't matter much in China. Being head of the party means everything. And he had clearly had much different goals in mind than did President Obama. Did he achieve what he set out to achieve? I think absolutely. In terms of the images that were broadcast back to China, Xi Jinping, strong, sturdy, competent on the world stage, able to deal with the most important bilateral partner. I think for him it was a home run. As for the United States, and you always kind of lowball these summits, not expecting a whole lot. It may have been slightly above average, but we end the summit probably with a disconnect in terms of our strategic alignment around the big issues that matter. Whether they be economics and the bilateral investment treaty, for example, which is going to be really important longer term. There wasn't much progress made there. On the security of the Asia-Pacific region, nothing said or done, rather, on the South China Sea. Same old language that we've heard for a long time, and that's respect for sovereignty and freedom of navigation. So that, and I was hoping to find some sort of strategic partnership as it relates to the Middle East, because I think we have interests aligned in the region, and it could have been a real home run for the United States to bring China into something a little more than just sanctions on Iran, where they played a role for some years now, and that wasn't part of it. So it left us all kind of wanting a little bit more and wondering where it goes. I'd have to say that the better than average aspect of the summit comes by way of both countries recognizing the importance of the protection of intellectual property. And for the first time in a joint statement, we actually saw that language enshrined in at least 2 sentences. And you know, in a 9 or a 10-page document, you might say, well, that doesn't count for much. Well, it actually does, because we've tried for a very long time to get just simply the recognition of the importance of protecting intellectual property in these documents and always failed. So the administration succeeded there, which means you framed the issue and now you can build content around that language, which will take time. So the test will be in the next theft of intellectual property, which runs to a rate of probably $300 billion per year in lost IP based on a commission that I co-chaired with Denny Blair a couple of years ago. That's a big number. That equals probably all of our exports to the Asia-Pacific region per year. China might be 50 or 60% of the total, but it's big. So we'll see where that goes. And I'll just end with this thought. I think the future of these bilateral summits really will depend on to what extent the heads of state want to put real skin in the game, because the U.S.-China relationship, I think, will become a head-of-state-driven relationship, not a strategic and economic dialogue-driven relationship, but a head-of-state relationship. I think Xi is prepared to manage it as such. I think President Obama made the political calculation a while ago that there's too much downside in the relationship potentially, so let's manage the downside and make sure it doesn't appear on the front pages too often, but he's neglected the upside of the relationship, which could be significant.
You want to jump in, Mr.
Yeah, just to reinforce what Ambassador Huntsman has said, and before Ian chips in. I think his analysis is broadly right. Firstly, the US-China relationship can only function at a strategic level involving total engagement by the most senior leaders, President and General Secretary of the party. The good thing that has evolved in the US-China relationship in the last several years is we now have a series of working level summits. This began in Sunnylands a couple of years ago. Last year was at Yingtai on the back of the APEC summit, and now this one. And frankly, first summit, getting to know you, but frankly, the amount of time that these two leaders have now spent with each other, the frankness of the conversations, particularly in Yingtai last year, and again this time, about basic questions of politics, economics, and foreign policy, means that it's become quite a robust, frankly, engagement between the two. And I'm from an old-fashioned school of diplomacy which says it's always better to have the lines open and the principals who know each other in case something really bad happens, or you actually want to pull off something good. And then the last point I'd make is just on the substantives coming out of the visit. I thought it was pretty good. Expectations prior to it were pretty disastrous in terms of the things going wrong in the relationship. But from a US point of view, a couple of things, two or three things come to my mind. One, that you have the outcome on cyber, which has been referred to in part by Ambassador Huntsman, as it relates to the IP element as well. There's explicit language from the Chinese president in his own words on this subject, which we have not had before. Number two, you then have explicit language from the Chinese president on that the renminbi will not be subject to competitive devaluation in the future. We do not have that language from the Chinese president before. We saw the partial devaluation of the renminbi by 3% over the last couple of months. That's significant. And the third one is this fundamental ground shift in Chinese policy on climate change, which is necessary for the planet, it's necessary for them, and their announcement of a cap in trade by 27, however flawed it may be in the startup, is, I think, good news. So on those three ones, I see policy wins. A lot of stuff yet to be resolved.
Let me just address the summit as well before I go to what your question will be, which I have no idea, and say, look, I obviously think that there was some real progress here, and both sides did get a reasonable amount. I mean, Obama avoided downside. It was reasonably well managed, and at the end of the day, given that there were some significant takeaways, even if the Chinese aren't going to actually follow through and implement, let's say on cyber, they can say that they moved the needle and they didn't have to push sanctions beforehand, which would have been a real problem for the relationship. But, I remember, Bob Zoellick, who we all know very well, talking about responsible stakeholdership. I think the Chinese are picking up a piece of that. They're becoming stakeholders. Look at what they're doing on China, on climate, because they know it's in their interest. They're becoming stakeholders. Look at how much money they're putting into infrastructure around the world. Look at the commitment they've just made to peacekeepers. But they're not becoming responsible stakeholders because they're not taking on the values that the Americans want them to. In fact, they're actually competing with US-led global architecture. And I think that's the crux of a significant challenge we're going to end up seeing between the United States and China. We can manage this as well as we want, and yet as the Chinese are getting larger, the willingness of both sides to create condominium and actual compromise on issues of what kind of values, economic, political, and social, we think the world should be governed with. This, I think, is going to create a lot of conflict.
Before I ask you the question, I want to point out that we have these handy-dandy iPad thingies, and feel free to lob a question in, and I will look at it and perhaps ask these gentlemen. So go for it. It's interesting to hear this assessment because it's probably more positive, I think, than the average American, even the average educated, news-watching American would think. So that's actually informative to me. I want to pick up on something the governor said and ask you, Ian, which has to do with the Middle East. You're a big macro guy. You think about how all these players are connected. How can we engage China when it comes to the Middle East? What is China's role? What's China trying to do, and what do we want them to do there?
Well, it's interesting that you asked that because when John was making the point on the fact that we share interests with the Chinese on the Middle East, and unfortunately nothing came out of it, I agree that we share interests with the Chinese in the Middle East. I think one of those national interests is to try to avoid getting entangled in things that we don't feel like we're going to develop a win on. And I think the Chinese are doing a really good job of following their national interest on that, and I think the Americans are not. And I think as long as that persists, it's going to be hard for the United States and China to actually come to terms here. there's no question that China very quickly is going to be the single largest economic and commercial driver of relations in the region. That's very different from saying the Chinese are going to take on refugees, but of course the Americans don't want to take on refugees either. There's actually, America's becoming more like China, its interest in the Middle East, than China's becoming more like the United States. And I think that that, of course, doesn't redound well for the Middle East, but it is an interesting way to think about how the countries are going to manage international issues around the world going forward.
Right. Governor Huntsman, you didn't particularly accentuate trade when you were just talking about the summit. Where does our trade relationship with China stand right now? I mean, there have been negotiations on that front, but given the economic conditions that are changing so rapidly, how do you assess things there?
Well, we have a missed opportunity in that we don't share between us a bilateral investment treaty, which to my mind would be the logical bridge between TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which includes 12 nation states, 40% of the world's GDP, and China's version of TPP, RCEP, which is done largely with many of their free trade partners. And eventually, without a bridge built between TPP and China, which I think has to be done over time, you'll have a head-on collision between two systems built on different standards of trade and investment. And as one person who's very active in trade and investment in the Asia-Pacific region, that would be a disaster. So that's going to have to be reconciled at some point, and I do think that by negotiating a bilateral investment treaty, which in effect is really the first chapter of any trade agreement, which is the investment chapter. It's the hardest one to negotiate. It's why Japan is having a hard time getting its act together with respect to TPP, because you got to open markets, you have to provide certain guarantees that go along with it. So the time and effort spent between the U.S. and China on a bit, I think, would be hugely consequential. And if we could use that as an overarching aspiration, listen, the U.S.-China relationship does better when we have something to work on. When we have nothing to work on together in a strategic sense, we then nitpick and we fall victim to the headlines of the day, which is not where we want to find the relationship. When we have something to work on together that is of strategic value to both sides, then the relationship, I think, is managed more ably and more successfully. So the TPP, I think, is going to be the next big deal, and how they then factor China into the efforts longer term. I would say that China is still struggling a little bit with some of their WTO commitments, which go all the way back to November of 2001, and that was the thousands of commitments that were made. And I think everyone knew when Zhu Rongji ran the risk of bringing China into the WTO that would be a long slog for them. And indeed, there are markets that are experiencing difficulty in terms of opening up and accepting investment and fair trade. But I think we in the West are always hoping for a level playing field, which I don't think is ever going to exist in China. I think you're always going to have some disequilibrium, and American firms are going to have to learn to deal with that disequilibrium, because the provinces play a big role, the federal government plays a fairly substantial role, and state-owned enterprises, as Kevin mentioned, are a big feature in the economy right now. Right. Faced with reform, which has to happen, but not much being delivered on as yet.
Prime Minister Rudd, I want to shift gears a little bit. As the former head of a country much closer to China than the United States, maybe this is salient, and it comes from the audience, so thanks for your questions. China's military, China's posturing in the South China Sea, is that really different? And if so, what does that mean for us?
I think to answer that question, and yeah, we have a sharper lens on what goes on in the region because that's where we are as Australians. Even though I now live here in New York, we watch it quite carefully. But I think it's important, before you drill down into South China Sea posture, which is to understand what's the Chinese lens on the world, frankly, and what's important to them. Dovetails with what's just been said about disappointment about not having a more forward-leaning Chinese posture on Middle Eastern questions. The number 1, 2, and 3 priority of this Chinese government party is the items we began our conversation on today, which is how do you successfully transform the Chinese economy for the future? So the economic underpinnings of China as a global great power, as potentially a superpower, are set in place. That occupies so much, frankly, political time and energy and attention in Beijing that we need to take pause sometimes before we leap to too many conclusions about dastardly Chinese global plans to do X, Y, and Z, A, B, and C. There is a huge focus on trying to get the economy right. Number two is, and again, looking at the question of how they view the world and the region, and I partly disagree with Ian here. I do so advisedly. It's not because of sock colour. It's because on global order questions, what I found fascinating about the Xi Jinping speech to the UN General Assembly the other day was that it is the most definitive statement I have seen from a Chinese leader about the centrality of the UN rules-based system for the future of the order. In the last several years since Xi Jinping has taken over, there's been a lot of loose language in the Chinese public commentaries and from some of the leadership about what sort of global order should there be in their assessment that the United States was in irreversible decline. That is now changing. And I think their language about the international rules-based system anchored in the UN is, on balance, pretty encouraging. They've just nominated 8,000 troops to become part of a ready action force for UN peacekeeping responsibilities. Climate change you've just spoken about. There's also development assistance cooperation. So does that solve all problems in terms of Chinese order? No. But when they look at the Middle East, my friends, and they look at the problems of Russia, the problems of the United States, the problems in the Gulf, the problems in Syria, they say there's a certain toxicity to any power jumping into that if they're not prepared to be full participants in a long-term solution. And they don't see that as being possible. And finally, on the region, the box of trouble, that is the South China Sea, has no immediate solution. On the one hand, as we all know, long-standing Chinese position since before the birth of communist China, Chiang Kai-shek's claim in 1948 about the 9-dash line around all of the South China Sea. Subsequently, the Chinese have maintained that as their position. They can't be seen to be backing down and taking a position weaker than the Chinese nationalists took before 49. But in recent years, it's become much sharper. The only way through this is to try and get to a stage where all parties realise that there has to be a negotiated accommodation which jointly shares exploration and extraction benefits and leaves the territorial questions to be resolved at some future point in history. Is that in prospect? No. Is that the only way to get through it? Yes.
Ian, is the United States mishandling the China relationship? And if so, how?
Well, I think a big problem the United States has is that the challenge that China poses to the U.S. is not a military challenge, as I think Kevin just made abundantly clear. It's not a diplomatic challenge. It's an economic challenge. And we don't have the tools for that. And we don't have the tools for that in a couple of obvious ways. And one thing we didn't mention, you asked us all about the summit. We've talked about it. But before the summit, there was the pre-summit in Washington State, where all of the CEOs of the major American tech firms were invited, and I use that word as advisedly as Kevin discusses my socks, about...
Won't let those go.
No. I didn't know when I was making the decision this morning that this was going to be so substantive. But, they were invited, and they had to show. And, I mean, for an American administration that was most taken with the idea that our IT firms were getting all of their IP ripped off through Chinese cyber attacks, and have all of those CEOs stand in line to say great things about Xi Jinping and say how much they want to do business with them, except the head of Uber, who was summarily removed from the photo beforehand because they now have serious competitors connected to the Chinese. That was kind of interesting. That undermines the Americans, right? It makes it harder because our private sector is not aligned with us. They just want to make short-term money. And then on the state side, we've suspended Exim Bank. You've got Jeff Immelt saying he's going to bring jobs to France. When's the last time you heard someone say they're going to bring jobs to France? Things have to be pretty bad to bring jobs to France, right? And we're not doing the IMF vote. We botched the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, something the three of us have spoken about at great length. The fact is that the United States does not do industrial policy well. There are many things the Americans are exceptionally good at. Our Defense Department, the CIA, the NSA, perhaps too good sometimes, the Pentagon. But I mean, if your kids end up at the Department of Commerce, you're like, what's that, the middle kid? What happened to that kid? That's not where you want to be. We're not good at that, right? And so I really think that in dealing with the Chinese...
Some people here may have kids at the Department of Commerce. Have you?
Yeah.
Just be a bit more sensitive.
I'm sorry. No, we love middle kids. There's nothing wrong with middle children. They just frequently don't.
Now
get
he
as
gets
much-
all politically
They
correct.
don't get as much attention as the other children. That's why. So sometimes they get lost. But no, I think to your point, I think we're going to have a very serious challenge in responding to what is responsible stakeholdership from the Chinese perspective, but not from ours on the economic side.
Shifting gears, Governor Huntsman.
John Huntsman worked at the Department of Commerce.
I know. Yeah. Oh no. Oh yeah.
Yeah.
You didn't.
And
No, I think he knew that.
and I looked at John Negroponte over at State Department and
Yeah.
thought, that's where the real people work.
Right.
But they taught us never to wear socks like that, Ian. You know,
Yeah.
if you do, pack an extra battery in your hip pocket
Right.
in case they go out.
Governor Huntsman, it's hard to leave the socks. But I'm gonna try to do it again. I was talking to someone from the Chinese consulate the other day here in New York, and they were all a buzz about the Republican presidential debate and Donald Trump, and this person just thought it was mind-blowing and cool, not unlike a lot of Americans, I guess. What do the Chinese think about U.S. politics, U.S. presidential elections, and this one in particular? What do you think?
It's absolutely inexplicable. In English.
Yeah.
And then try it in Chinese.
Right.
Right, Kevin? How do you describe the rise of Donald Trump and the rhetoric that is being used in ways where people say, okay, that sounds sensible. That sounds like a good thing for the United States longer term. Close your borders, send people away, stop trade. And so we go through these cycles called presidential primaries, and they become circus acts, and we have to say, this too shall pass, and we'll get into the general, and you hope by the time you get into the general election that you've got people with a sense of strategy, a vision for the country, which takes into account its role in the world. So Fred Kemp, who runs the Atlantic Council, and the good people at the Atlantic Council, we've undertaken an effort this year to talk about America's role in the world by bringing in candidates, noted academics, people on Capitol Hill. It's a conversation that needs to happen. And we can all talk about it in the parlors of New York and Washington, but it ain't going to happen or be a reality until you get a president who can actually lead this nation in the kind of conversation that we need to have, which is a grown-up conversation about America's role in the world and why their stakes are so high to get it right, both from an economic standpoint and a security standpoint. And that's an impossible conversation to have in the primary phase. How do I know? I tried it. Kevin is a successful person at getting to the top position in Australia. He did all right.
Yeah.
Some of us have tried, and I have to tell you, having any kind of sensible, sane, realistic conversation about America's role in the world and how to manage the U.S.-China relationship in the primary doesn't get you anywhere. You get booed off the stage. Declaring war on China and being as aggressive and assertive as you can brings the sound bites and the applause lines, and people stand up and cheer. So, and this is one that you talked earlier, Andy, about sort of missed opportunities. Where are we getting it wrong? And I think our whole political discussion is tilted toward what to do to China as opposed to do what we should be doing with China, which is a conversation we should be having at this point.
Prime Minister, you said back in the green room, we know who's going to be running China in 5 years. We don't know who's going to be running the United States in 5 years. And that makes it difficult, right?
The Chinese ask me about this all the time. I'm in and out of Beijing quite frequently. And they say, who's going to win? I said, look, I'm not even a voter. I mean, and any intelligent American analyst will quickly tell you it's too early to say. But I'd say two things. One is our Chinese friends have a deal of experience in dealing with the vicissitudes of American primaries politics. They've seen it all before, perhaps not quite as spectacular as this one, but they have a factored in element to their reaction to this. They know that there is a circus element. They know that the circus comes to a conclusion. The problem is if we see any of that theatrics sustain itself into the actual management of the United States government on the core question of China. The second point I'd make is this, is as a friend of the United States, which I've been my whole life, my whole life. Australia's a ally of the United States for 100 years. Everyone who is a friend and ally of the United States wants this country to succeed, the US. And I think the great thing about the difficult, hard road to economic recovery post the crisis is that it said to the world at large, including those in China, who thought that the American economy was finished, that in fact there's a great underlying resilience to this economy and you know how to bounce back. This has been a great testament of American economic strength and the resilience of your underpinning capital system. If you can do the same in terms of the future management and resilience of the American political system, this would complement the former effectively. But at present, if I look at the critique coming out of the Chinese and various other parts of the world about dysfunctionalities in the American political system, they point to redistricting and how the Congress ends up in the way in which it does. They point to campaign finance out of control, and they begin to mount a systemic critique that this liberal democracy, this light on the hill, is not exactly what it's actually is not as good as it's described. So, as the world's remaining superpower, and coming from another democracy as I do, the re-engineering of elements of your democratic system is actually fundamentally important for the future of democracy across the collective West.
You know what? We're out of time, but I want to ask you one last question. I'm going to give you the last word. If you can answer it very, very quickly, and which is the slowdown in China's growth, economic growth, secular or cyclical?
I think it's secular, but I agree with Kevin. The issue is the management of the transformation, not the management of the slowdown. I think the real question, China will become the largest economy in the world, there's no question. When it does, the level of uncertainty around its trajectory will be greater than that of any major economy that we've ever experienced in our lifetimes. And I think we all know what the problems are. They know what the problems are. But the impact that has for the Americans in terms of strategic thinking and decision-making, as well as for U.S. multinational corporations, is immense and hasn't yet been factored in.
All right, there is so much more to talk about, and I guess I can just hope that we can get the three amigos back together at some point to continue the conversation. But in the meantime, please join me in thanking Ian Bremmer, Prime Minister Rudd, Governor Huntsman, and Ian Sachs.